Hello and welcome to another edition of Meet the Manager from fantasyfootballscout.co.uk. In this series we meet a manager with an exceptional track record in their Fantasy Premier League career. We find out their strategies for success as well as gather some top tips for doing well in the current campaign. Today I'm joined by Richard Clarke, who has already spent the early part of the season at the top of our Hall of Fame, which measures those in our leagues with stellar scores over their career. And he's currently in third spot. Over his 12 previous campaigns, he has 7 top 10,000 finishes, including ranks of 263 and 303. In fact, his lowest ever rank and finish across his career is around 32,000. And he is on course for another great season with an overall rank well within the top 100k. Richard, welcome. How are you?
I'm very well, Joe. Thank you for your kind words, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, especially looking at that career history. It really is something else. So many high ranks in there, and a bad finish for you is 32k. I mean, that's many people's top finish ever. If that if they can get in, that's still pretty respectable. So firstly, I mentioned about our Hall of Fame there. What would it mean to you to actually clinch that number one spot in our Hall of Fame by the end of this season?
Well, it would be really, a great thing to get to that goal. It's been a goal for me for quite a while, and I started to focus on it seriously about halfway through last season when I started to rise up the Hall of Fame ranks, and my in-season ranking was very good, but I suddenly realised I had a chance to get into the top 10. And then from the top 10, I got to sort of number 3 for a while, and then was really in rubbing shoulders with the Marks and the Jays and the Vilays of this world, and just felt that I would try and focus on finishing as high as I could within that table last season. I think I finished 6th in the end, and then after that thought, well, it's not going to take an unbelievable swing in my favour in the beginning part of this season in order to maybe get to the top for a week or two, which actually happened about 3 weeks ago. So felt chuffed to bits just to be top of the lives for a couple of weeks. Whether or not I can sustain it and get to the top at the end of the season, that's a different challenge because I'm in some pretty exalted company.
Well, I mean, looking at your career history, you've got every chance of doing that, and hopefully this won't put a curse on you. I know on our Scoutcast when we've had managers on, they've ended up plummeting down the ranks as soon as we've interviewed them. But hopefully that won't happen here. So let's have a look at that career history in a bit of detail. There's 2 key elements there: no bad season, and lots of quite very good seasons, and a couple within the top 1,000. So it's a 2-part question, really. What does it take to get a respectable finish, which is 30,000 or below, really? And also, secondly, what does it take to then make that leap into the top 1k?
Ooh, okay. Well, personally, I always set a goal for a top 10k finish, as the stats will probably suggest. 30k. Was if it's relevant was the Leicester season, when because of the way I play, which is based on fundamentally a game of probability, it's not surprising that I didn't do that well in a season when a 5,000 to 1 shot won the Premier League. I was a little slow to cotton on. I'm also a Chelsea supporter, and they didn't do too well either after being champions. So those things, make a big difference at the start if you don't really follow the probability model in a season, which it was quite a quirky season. But in terms of what it takes to get into the top 30k or a top 10k type team, some of the important attributes are the strategy has got to be correct at the outset, so good planning before the start of the season. I always start a season in the same way, which is to group fixtures into 3 brackets: the good fixtures, the middle fixtures, and the avoid fixtures. And I will pick a squad for that for the first 6 game weeks. I found that consistently gets me off to good starts, and that can be, obviously, it's really hard to catch up in FPL.
What would be an example of one of those types of fixtures? An avoid and a go for and a okay.
Well, I mean, if you're taking this season as an example, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near a Newcastle or a West Ham player in the first 6 or 7 game weeks, because of simply if they're playing 4 of the top 6 or 3 of the top 6 during that period, you're going to find there's, just better options elsewhere with better fixtures. So you're better off going for a value player from a lower team that has really good fixtures to begin with. So Crystal Palace, Bournemouth being this season's examples, and now Wolves. There's a lot of value in those teams, and you're better off having teams in there at the start of the season than you are just going for a lot of teams from the top, a lot of players from the top 6, or a lot of players who's from teams whose fixtures are bad at the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other things that I do, that's not a surprise. I do put a lot of hours into, disseminating the fire hose of information that's out there nowadays. There's a lot of information to disseminate, and you have to process a lot of information and probably largely ignore about 80% of it, and then make your decision correctly. But that comes with a time penalty. There's a lot of time that goes into diligently making those decisions. Those would be the critical elements, I think. I don't think it's easy to luck your way through an FPL season now. There's just too much information out there, and sites like FFS are obviously providing a lot of that information.
I just wanted to go back to that point about obviously that fire hose of information. That's a great way of describing it, and especially as each season there's more and more of it as well. You've been in this game a long time. So what has your experience taught you about the type of information to ignore and the type of information to say, right, that's gold? Good question. I think a great example is just going to be the recent one is probably the article about everybody jumping on the Harry Kane bandwagon last weekend. I'm guilty of that. Perhaps you are too, and a lot of the rest of the community will have done the same. But really, when you look back on it with some hindsight, you see that it was, one match for a team that's just played Barcelona. I actually went to that game. And they had, several key players out. All the information's there behind the scenes to suggest that Harry Kane wasn't necessarily a great buy, but such was the momentum behind everybody moving to him, partly because you needed to cover it off. That everybody were like kids in a playground following a football, and all jumped on that option, and what do you get? 1 point back. So that's just kind of example of information that's put out there, and actually often hyped by the media or the social media aspect of things, that massively influences behaviour, not just from me, but from the majority of the community, when actually one game and then you perhaps don't need Kane now for at least half a dozen matches because of fixtures and other better captain options. So that's a great recent example. If that makes sense. No, it does. I mean that's how to get a good finish. It makes sense. A lot of what you've been saying there would be advice I'd follow. Even the Kane one, obviously, is a trap I fell into. You disseminate certain information. For example, he's playing a very weak defence. But at the same time, how do you make that information? How do you turn that into a top 1,000 finish? You've had a couple of them, and you've got near there as well a few times.
Yes. Top 1,000 finishes. Certainly, no one, I don't think, could be arrogant or confident enough to say they'll get one of those every year. I think they're rare. You need to have a good start to get a top 1K finish, because it's hard to catch up. You need consistency of captain calls, so you don't need your captain blanking. And one thing I think a lot of the players that have got top 1,000 finishes in their locker is they have patience. You have to have patience in fantasy football. Allow players you bring in several weeks to score and make returns. Make sure that you give your wildcard a chance to have high returns over a decent period before you start changing it all around. Well-timed and particularly last season, very well timed chip execution towards the end of the season. That's really important, and some real basic stuff. Watch football. I watch a lot of football, not just from an enjoyment perspective or supporting a team, but watching it almost always with an FPL lens. The eye test is certainly something that people should deploy, and buy the players that they see, they see performing on the pitch. Other things I do well that others may not is I completely ignore team loyalty. Being a supporter of a team is irrelevant when it comes to fantasy
which is your
football.
team?
Yeah, Chelsea.
Okay.
But just ignore team loyalty when it comes to playing. And one other thing I don't hear people mention so much is analyzing your competition. So one of the things I do quite a lot of is I'm quite voyeuristic when it comes to looking at other people's teams in or around me. So when I was in the top 10 last year of the Hall of Fame, I concentrated quite a lot on the structure and makeup of the other teams in the top 10 and put together differential plans, to have different players to them, or players that, where my team's stronger than theirs in areas where theirs was weak. And actually that did, to a certain extent, pay off, because it narrows the playing field down to the people that you're immediately competing with. You could apply the same thing to a mini league situation, but also trying to compete against 5.7 million others is no one's got that amount of time.
I mean, that's a good point, because a lot of people look at ownership and of players as an overall quantity of 5.5 million people. But what you do is you don't just even narrow it down to the top 10,000. You narrow it down really to a core of about 10, maybe 20 managers that are going to be up there and competing every season. So you're looking at the best and looking how to get better than the best. So that's something anyone can do, really. Anyone's got access to our Hall of Fame or the various other leagues that have the great and the good in it. That's something that no one else has mentioned before, that it's a game and you're competing against people. That's
it, and it's free information, right? It's open. Apart from last week's transfer, you can see exactly what everybody else has got in their hand, and I find that really valuable. You could say, "Oh, that's cheating. It's unethical," but actually, it's not. It's you've now put a little click through next to everybody's name in the Hall of Fame, which makes it a lot easier than typing in a 7-digit number into the top corner every time. You can now just click through to everybody's team really easily. So I really like that feature, and also the fact that it's being updated now weekly rather than kind of sporadically is also helping.
We have had a few comments. You mentioned about luck earlier, and we have had a few comments about our Meet the Managers series. Why do none of them mention luck? Why is the assumption that it's all skill to get there? I mean, I always turn around and say, well, look at that track record. You can't get lucky every year. So what do you think of that? How much do you think luck exists? And I want to pull you back to another word you mentioned, probability. And how much can you make your own luck?
Okay. I think that luck, does even itself out over time. There'll be times when you feel unlucky because you put a player on the bench and he hauled and you didn't get the points. But similarly, you'll have another circumstance in the season when one of your players won't play and you will get points off the bench, for example. There's different elements of luck. It evens out over time, and I think that in respect of the Hall of Fame measure, I think that over 10 plus years, that really is going to reward consistent play. I've seen a few of the other interviews, and the people have great rankings on there, but they might have had one bad season that penalises them. So I think the Hall of Fame isn't really based on luck. I think luck is my luck is not down to a lack of due diligence or grafting it out there. I think if you want to make your own luck, be well informed, process that fire hose of information that's out there, and getting back to your point, that fundamentally fantasy football is is a game of probability and not chance. It's not like roulette or throwing a dice. It's basically, a lot of information to process. You've got to skillfully fundamentally predict football results and the points that come thereof. And that the skill is processing all that info and choosing what to action and when. If you're focused and dedicated to that, you've got a better chance of making the right calls. It doesn't mean you won't make bad calls. I've made several already myself this season, but generally speaking, over 38 weeks, you'll make the majority of right calls if you treated it like a work task.
Another source of information for all managers, but especially managers like yourself, is the fire hose of stats that are out there as well. So I'm not you like many others have access to a variety of underlying stats as well, not just who scored the goal, how many shots they've had, how many on target, how many chances people have created, and so on. What for you are the key stats that you look at that influence your transfer decisions, and also any kind of key advice for people in understanding getting the most out of those stats?
Okay, yeah. As I mentioned, I play and have always played quite subjectively. So I'm not really an out and out stats man. I know there are lots of information available, particularly on the site and other sites that really break down the metrics. I tend to play quite a lot of focus to fixtures over form. So I use the season ticker a lot. I use the FPL statistics site for price market changes, etc., and the discovery site for percentages of chip use and captain choice and stuff like that. But beyond that, I don't really look too much at stats. I think I mentioned earlier breaking down the season into groups of 6 matches. Again, with the sort of good middle avoid type tactic, that can work well when you're about to play a wildcard, for instance, or go through a busy period like Christmas or something like that, to actually just break the season down into a bunch of smaller seasons and plan your transfer strategy around that. I've always played that way. Whether those days are coming to an end or are going to get harder because of the raft of statistical information available, I don't know. For the minute, the old method is holding up okay, but it may not always.
Okay, well let's turn to the current campaign and your current setup here. So we're putting your team up on the screen and have a look at that. I mean, one thing I want to come to first, you mentioned him before, Harry Kane. It was a decision. There's a lot of information about him. We could have looked at that information as a fellow Kane knew, getting him in and captaining him. We could have looked at that information and done all of the things that you said about the fact that Spurs are not a bit out of sorts, key players are missing, and Kane himself has not been performing as well as others. We could have looked at that and said no. Or we could have looked at it and said Cardiff have conceded the lowest amount of goals, joint lowest amount of goals in the season. Kane's just scored against Barcelona. Surely he's going to score and to get something against Cardiff. Let's look at that Kane decision. What went through your head about getting Kane in? Because this is quite an important way, because you'd actually seen him, so you've got the eye test as well on him.
Yeah, and he played pretty well last Wednesday. And I think it was one of those calls where I felt that the impact of not having him for last weekend and the potential for him to score a hat-trick when captain, because basically anyone who got him in would captain him, that would immediately create a sort of 35, 40 point swing that you'd have to make up. And I felt that I was starting to get on the back foot to other players. I had a good start to the season, got into the top 10k, but it was starting to slide a bit. And I felt that if I didn't get Kane in, and he did haul, that I would be, sliding down the rankings. So it was almost a hedge to get him in rather than a strategic move. I felt that the field would move to him. Therefore, I had to go with the pack on that occasion. Even if he didn't haul, everybody else would not have got a haul either. So it was quite a negative move. But sometimes those moves are necessary in order to de-risk the bigger picture, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and that's exactly my train of thought, and I would imagine it's exactly the train of thought of so many who got Kane in. It wasn't until I was recording the Breakfast Club, another of our video series, at the weekend, and was talking to Luke, I guess then, who wasn't so keen on Kane, and he was favouring Hazard. And when I was looking at the ownership, it occurred to me that actually the hedging move was actually to captain Hazard, because amongst the top 10,000 he had an effective ownership of 122%, whereas Kane wouldn't have done as much damage as I think we thought. Is that perhaps a lesson there that managers like yourself, who are aiming for those top finishes, need to perhaps look a little bit more at those effective ownership stats, and players like Hazard, who
it's a good learn, and it's not a stat I look at greatly. It's one I've heard about and consider, but I almost consider it, unmetrically, rather than actually looking at the stats itself. In fact, I took a hit last Saturday, of which last Friday, one of which was to sell Salah for Hazard, in order to free up the money to get Kane. So I did get the Hazard points, but obviously I was late getting Hazard. So one of the things I should have done weeks ago was get Hazard, but I got him in to enable the money to do the Kane upgrade. So it's better to have him for half his points or than none. But I get what you're saying. I think effective ownership, and the more, when you're in that sort of two captain candidate situation, it's certainly a stat worth looking at.
So let's look at the rest of your team there. One of the things, there's a kind of a common trait there, kind of a template, because this would fit the way that you play. You're looking at the template of the good players, and you want to make sure you can match them and then better them as well. So you're going for that, investing a bit more in defence than perhaps you might normally. Alonso and Mendy are expensive there. You've tapped into Wolves, and you've been tapping into the Palace clean sheets as well. So you mentioned fixtures, big blocks of fixtures. So Palace have had a great one. It's coming to an end. Wolves gets a bit mixed. Leicester, you've gone in on, all right, they're fine. They've got good fixtures coming out. But Bournemouth as well, you've got a couple of their assets as well. Their fixtures turn as well a bit. So what teams are you looking at kind of next 5 or 6 to kind of perhaps replace some of those teams where the fixtures are starting to run out a bit?
Sure. Well, I'm generally a late wildcarder. Still have my wildcard to use. And for the last couple of seasons, I've played it on or around this time, sort of second, third international break. That's worked well for me. I don't know whether it'll work well for me this season. It feels like the guys that wildcarded maybe a couple of weeks ago, between games 4 wins, 6, probably it's worked out well for them so far. So I feel a little bit on the back foot. I probably will wildcard this week or next. Mainly because of that big fixture swing away from Bournemouth and Palace, where I'm heavily invested. And I think it's really important also to get the heavy hitter mix right for the sort of upcoming run of Liverpool matches, Man City matches, players like De Bruyne coming back, etc. There's a lot of changes that I would make to that squad right now. So feels like the right time. Also, there's still quite a bit of value out there to be had. Some of the players have not yet, started to rise rapidly. So I think leaving it a little bit longer would possibly mean that a lot of the value's been rinsed out. So those are all the reasons why I would probably wildcard in one of the next 2 weeks. Whether or not that gives me ultimately an advantage over the players that have done it already, I don't know. I've certainly slid down the last couple of weeks due to that, that inertia over wildcard.
So what are the players that you're looking at? Who's on your watch list? Say you wildcard this week or next week. Who's on your watch list that you don't already own?
Okay. So I like Arnautovic. Had him at the beginning of the season, despite my fixture policy, and he appears to be, fairly fixture proof. West Ham have turned it around to a certain extent, and I think they'll score well over their upcoming fixtures. I'll probably invest further in Wolves players. They look really solid, and apart from a couple of games where they play, I think, back-to-back against top 6 opposition in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I think they've got a reasonable run. And probably going back to the sort of structure that was there at the start of the season, where people loaded up on Liverpool and City assets. I think despite yesterday's kind of stalemate game, they still look the 2 strongest teams, and I think I'll probably have sort of 4, 5, 6 Liverpool and City players in my team after Wildcard. Aguero will come back. I hung on to Mendy. I'm not sure whether that was the right decision, but that's partly why I played him yesterday, because a bit of a differential. So I might hang on to Mendy, but I'm worried he might get rotated.
So Salah would be back. You see Salah as a key player?
I don't know about Salah. Okay. I honestly think I saw a podcast from Jay that said he felt that Salah was well overpriced, and I tend to agree with him. I think there's a lot of players that will do at least as well as him this season for available between 9 and 11 million. I don't think 13 million. He needs to be scoring every week for that. And to me, I'd rather have the money and go with a Mane or a Firmino as covering the Liverpool top line. I just think 13 million or thereabouts is too much for the kind of, he's returned to the mean a little bit, hasn't he? So I'll probably leave him alone for a while.
And what about formation as well? So I mean, you've been pretty much 3-4-3 apart from here really, with a 4-4-2.
I've probably been 3-4-3 for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think the only time I didn't do it was last weekend, when I wanted to drop King to the bench. And
with Palace's fixtures stiffening, with, as you mentioned, Arnautovic, and obviously Mitrovic as well still has some good fixtures coming up as well. Do you see yourself moving back to much more of a kind of a 3-4-3?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of value strikers either side of one premium asset. I think that works well. There's probably going to be a bit of a swing towards Lacazette coming in the next few weeks. That's tempting as a potential wild card move, but it will take 2-3 million out of the midfield positions, which is what where I think I'd rather spend it. I think I'd rather have the option of going 3-5-2 with a strongish midfield than actually out and out 3-4-3 with a bench fodder midfielder. That's probably going to be. I've got Ward at the moment, but he's injured and he's been dropped, and so he's going to go. And I'll probably have 5 decent midfielders and 2 sub 7 million strikers would be my way forward.
And just before we go, I always ask as well, managers like yourself, whether you've spotted any kind of key trends. Every season is different. You've got similar strategies of dealing with different situations. One season, Leicester can win the Premier League, but this season, what do you think is the emerging theme from this season so far? Or has there been one yet?
Yeah, well, I think this season more than any other, there's the same sort of core template of players, maybe 25 players that most people have in their squads. They all seem to be performing, which is leading to a lot of sameness between squads, and as things settle down, it will probably follow last season a little bit, in that it will become very difficult to make ground. It feels this season like the transfer market's been cranked up a notch, and that price rises are happening a bit faster than last season, and also the sort of behaviour amongst the masses is a little bit like a scene from World War Z, or that Sky advert where everyone's trying to get into the football ground by climbing over one another. There's just this mad rush that keeps going on. Now that may be what happens every season in the first 6-7 weeks, but it just seems to be happening an awful lot, and it seems to be the same players. Another example like Doherty from Wolves, getting 3 or 4 massive scores in 3 or 4 game weeks. Hazard consistently scoring, although that's maybe not that much of a surprise, but just the same core players. It's not a spread of 30, 40 players. It's a spread of about 20, 25 players that seem to be returning those scores, if that makes sense. And that's going to make it hard if you're not in position after sort of the first 3 months to catch up, because everyone's going to have those teams, and you won't. It will be very hard to find differentials.
Yeah, and obviously they'll be more expensive if you're coming to them late.
Indeed.
As well.
Indeed.
But for now, Richard, thanks so much for joining us. I've learnt a lot, and I hope others do. Good luck with your game week, and good luck with the rest of your season and your quest for the top of the Hall of Fame alongside many others. But yeah, thank you, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers, and good shout out to the site. Great site, really great content, and I enjoy all the Scoutcasts, etc. So good luck with it all. Thanks,
Cheers.
Jack.
Thanks a lot for that. Bye now.
All right. Cheers.